I can condense as much as possible within 5 or 10 minutes a 35-year-old journey. So I'll try and do that. One night, me and my wife were watching television at a house in Karachi where I switched on. This was 90s, early 90s. I switched on the TV, and at that moment, you didn't have Z, you did not have any of these Indian networks, and of course, none of the Pakistani networks, because it was state television. And I switched on what was Star TV, being broadcast out of Hong Kong. I think Javed would be familiar with that over here. And I switched it on, and the first program was Entertainment Week India. I switched that channel. On BBC, it was India Business Report. And therefore, and then I had an idea, why do we not have a weekly program on Pakistan on either BBC or the Star Network? The Star Network used to actually carry BBC programming. So next morning, I get up and ring up a friend of mine who was in the, well, he's an icon in the advertising industry, no less a person than Mr. Javed Jabbar, whose presence we are very honored to have. Please raise your hand.
Everybody knows Javed.
Yes. Yeah. And I went to Javed and I said, Javed, I know nothing about television. Could you help me out here? But I mean, I know about the writing part, I know about business, so I'd like to have a business program on the BBC relating to Pakistan. And anyway, off we went to Hong Kong, to Star Network. They said, you're not wanted here, you have to go and talk to the BBC in London, and through the auspices of some other good friends, like the High Commissioner, I think, if I remember, Javed, who then introduced us to the BBC, and we went to London, and they said, okay, we'll come to Pakistan. And hence, we had two people coming to Pakistan, and they asked me on the first morning, so where are you going to record the program? So I took them to a place in Sabzi Mandi. I don't know whether your people are familiar with that. Sabzi Mandi के पास एक dilapidated building थी, जिसमें एक होता था जो commercials करता था. I'm sure that Javed is familiar with that person. And he was an expert in doing commercials. So I said, here is where we will record our program. They said, all right. Where are you going to do the graphics? I took them all the way back to Clifton. They were these young boys who had started a graphic company called, Graphic something. And I said, here's where we're going to do the graphics. They said, okay, and then so on and so forth. And in the evening, we ended up at my house for dinner. And they said, Zafar, quite frankly, let us advise you. If you want to do it, establish a private production company, like, NDTV in India had just been established by Pranoy Roy. And there was one other production company. I said, well, help me out with it. They said, well, we've got a retired, somebody's just retired from the BBC. I said, well, I'll hire him. And in he came, and then that's how the story began. But I was happy to be friends who helped me out on the technical side, a lot of people helped me out. And we had our first TV program, which was then aired on, I think Tahir is not here, on NTM. It was called Pakistan Business Week, helped by my friend Javed Pasha. I'm sure he'll remember that particular meeting very well when we sealed the deal. So, and then it was followed by, in those days, we had Pakistan Television Corporation, so I took up the slot within the 9 o'clock Khabarnama of PTV, which was called Tijarati Khabrein. So we launched Tijarati Khabrein. And then, of course, one thing led to the other. We launched an English program, weekly program on CNBC, which established my relationship with CNBC. We had Question Time Pakistan on BBC, which established my relationship with the BBC. And then we went on, and I knew the Middle East very well, so I proposed to the CNBC people in Asia, how about launching an Arabic channel? I didn't know Arabic, by the way, but still. We then were lucky to launch CNBC Arabia, which is a story in itself. And beyond that, then, when with CNBC Arabia, I once had the occasion, somebody took me to South Africa, and I discovered it was, world-class infrastructure there. And so we went on to establish CNBC Africa. And on one conference, I think I met the Prime Minister then, who said, well, you keep on establishing these TV stations outside Pakistan. Why don't you do something in Pakistan? Why don't you get CNBC? So I got CNBC Pakistan, which proved to be the biggest disaster ever. But these things happen.
So why was it a disaster?
Well, you see, okay, I'm glad you've asked this question. Because of ratings. CNBC as a channel in every part of the world does not sell on ratings, but it sells on the audiences that follow it, who have the power to make decisions, and then money follows. However, the business model in Pakistan was that, and it remains to date, that if you don't have ratings, you don't get advertising.
So, Zafar, with so many channels in Pakistan, you talk about ratings, there's so many channels, there are hundreds now. I mean, when you started CNBC, there was a handful. But now it's in the hundreds. And you don't see audiences, you don't see advertising, revenue streams are drying up. How are people surviving? Is it just on ratings? Have a few channels survive? What did the rest do?
Well, in order to establish a TV channel, I will talk about news. Entertainment is a different kettle of fish.
Even news has ratings.
News, what people don't understand is, once you've got the license, which is $2 million, you spent another $12 million on infrastructure, that's $14 million. And before you know it, 3 years down the road, you're down $50 million, and yet to see any advertising coming through. So if you have $50 million to spare or throw away in the dustbin, do come into the news channel business. The business model in Pakistan is all about ratings. However, in the rest of the world, and I believe it will happen in Pakistan, the model for TV stations is subscription plus advertising. So cable operators share their earnings on a per subscriber basis with the TV stations. And that is how TV stations outside of Pakistan make a lot of money.
Right, because $50 million is a lot. And given the number of stations, I'm just wondering how many of them have actually spent that kind of money. But
well, can I answer that question
yes,
very frankly? One, now I don't have any business interests in Pakistan, so I can say this, is people come into the news business because they want to protect their other business interests. Two, they come into this because they want, it opens doors for you, okay? I think there are very few people who are in this business who have been in this business for a very long time. So,
So you've had this huge experience over so many years, film distribution and then production houses and television channels, etc. So what's with the book? Why have you written this book that we've come to talk about today? Because the title is intriguing. And by the way, the book will be for sale. Zafar is happy to sign it afterwards if anyone wants after this session. But how did the book come about, and also the title?
Okay, simply put, I knew nothing about television when I came into this business. So I looked and searched for books. I'm talking about the 90s. And I couldn't find a single book which contained everything, from launching a channel into programming, into editing, into newsrooms, into the various facets of a TV station. So over the years, whatever I learned, I thought it's best that if somebody else, or more particularly students or journalists or people who want to enter the media sector, they should have this particular book and it contains everything. They should not step back to actually look around for various books, just buy one book. And it's like I wanted to share my knowledge, really.
Yeah, but it's 3.0, not 101.
Well, you see, 3.0 is very simply put, the World Economic Forum describes this as the 4.0 era, which is the fourth industrial revolution. And nobody would disagree with that because, you know, you have had technology at its most disruptive to every aspects of industry within the industrial sector and also impacting private personal lives. But in television, you know, I would term 1.0 as when the family used to sit down and, for example, in Pakistan, watch the Khabarnama. That was a big thing, 9 o'clock, initially when PTV started. Or certain shows, the whole family would sit down. Also in Europe and in America, it was the 6 o'clock news or the 7 o'clock news. So that was an era of 1.0. In 1980s, something happened. Two events. One was CNN was launched. And by the way, when CNN was first launched by Mr. Ted Turner, it was the president, I think, of NBC who said, oh, this is a chicken noodle network. How can they compete with us? We've got $500 million a year that we spend. They've got no money. But it all changed. The space shuttle explosion was shown live on CNN. And it gathered millions and millions of live viewership at that moment. The second event that changed the world, in fact, our part of the world, was the Gulf War. When CNN was first started beaming live in the Middle East and Asia. Now that changed governments and the way they wanted to, you know, they knew the genie was out of the bag, and hence that was the ushering in of private channels or regulations that would lead to the establishment of private channels. 3.0 is the age of digital and streaming. Who would have thought Netflix would have been the success it was, and now it's being followed by Apple, Amazon, BBC is coming into it, ITN is coming into it, Sky is coming into it, so you name it. And so that's why I've called my book 3.0.
So young people today don't really watch television. I mean, as you said, it's live streaming. They're watching everything on their phones or computers or, you know, a tablet that they're carrying around with them. So is the 24-hour live news cycle still so important, or is that going to change as well? Are you going to have to repackage it for this younger generation?
Generation Z. I mean, we are done with X and Y, so we are in Generation Z. Technology is in their blood. So these were people born in mid-1995 to 2012. And by the way, there are 2 billion of them on our planet. And considering that the world's population, as measured last year, was 7.7 billion, this is a substantial majority. And you add a Generation Y and Generation X to it, i.e. you cut off 55 and above, we who are above 55 are out of this game. We have to learn every day. We have to keep up. My daughters or my son is teaching me every day whatever transpires on the smartphone. So this generation, the first thing they come to is their smartphone. They don't wait for news to happen or it's on the social media, they connect. They binge watch instead of wait now for every episode. Their life revolves around Uber, Airbnb, and the various other things that have come into our lives. So news to them, and their view is that traditional media does not cover what we want to see and hear. You know, it's to do with climate change, it is to do with many other aspects of life, which is more important to them than the normal breaking news is.
Okay, I have to say I'm guilty of binge watching as well. I'm terrible. And it's awful because you start binge watching, your eyes have turned square and you know, like you're doing nothing else. It's really bad. But, you know, you touched on this a little bit, but if you think about the fact that there are so many channels now, entertainment, news, music, food, religious channels, weather, I mean, you name it, it's there. How do you fight for viewership? What is the key to the success of any channel surviving this
Well,
competition?
Simply put, it's the quality of your content. Number one, the trust, the truthfulness, and the impartiality that you, through your editorial policy that you give. A team which produces the best there is. And over a long-term period, people are not, you know, they can see behind. Any person watching a TV news channel can see behind the general editorial policy. So it is quality and trust that you create viewership.
So you take the traditional quality, trust, good content, everything, but how are you going to transcend it now into this new digital era?
Oh, this digital era is big. It's big. People have not yet understood what the digital era really is all about. People are groping. They are groping in the dark simply for one reason, because they have been unable to see revenues coming out of it. I mean, everybody wants to have an app. Everybody wants to increase their digital. Let me give you just one example. When Jeff Bezos purchased the Washington Post, I mean, he doesn't interfere in his normal businesses, but he was interested in the Washington. So he said, why don't you guys, you know, I've got this technology platform, I've got huge, wonderful people working for me as far as technology is concerned. Why don't you get some in the Washington Post and see? Now, the Washington Post CEO told me that they put 2 people in the newsroom of the Washington Post. And the journalists resisted it so much that it was impossible for them to work. I mean, I've had a similar experience in SAMAA. I kept on saying, please, but yet I get resisted and they get resisted. However, what changed was when the journalist stories started to get published on the website and they started to get input from readers. That changed the journalist mentality. Today, the Washington Post print edition makes a huge loss, whereas its digital side makes the profit to keep it alive. So that's one example, but there's a newspaper as well in Canada which stopped publication and went only digital. That's doing very well. Okay, that's the print side. Okay, on the media side, I think in television, all television channels. Now, the big ones in America, they'll buy their way out. They'll open their checkbooks and buy out the startups that come, which present either a threat to them or which they perceive as the future to their digital strategy. They'll just open their checkbook. I mean, $100, $200 million or $1 billion is not too much for, you know, the Turners of the world.
I like the small change concept.
No, it's not much, quite frankly. That will change. But here in Pakistan, I think it's important to understand that digital is the future. We have to cope with it. We've got to change our university curriculums around that. The mere fact of, I won't go into things like coding and various aspects of computing, but that has to change to get this country from where it is now to jumpstart it.
So how do you jumpstart? Because you talked about Bezos buying the Washington Post. So it's almost like there's this traditional nexus that everyone feels that you've got to have some control over the media. You know, if you own a media house, you're more powerful. You have a greater voice. You can actually control what's maybe being said about you as well. But a lot of people get into the media because they want control over what's being said or what should be said. So how do you see this? Because when businesses own media, they kind of control the content and make it work for them, as opposed to, the whole traditional ethos of the media, which is, truth and integrity and all that kind of stuff.
Well, I don't think anybody can control what goes on in the light of social media today. The genie is out of the bag. In the old days in print, you had what was called the Green Brigade. I don't know whether Mr. Jabbar has heard about this. The Green Brigade, people used to write in green ink to the British tabloid and other respectable newspapers in the UK. And as soon as the editors saw this letter in green ink, they would take it and without reading it, put it in the dustbin. However, with what is happening now, the fear is that the genie again is out of the bottle as far as fake news is concerned. I mean, if you were to look at the percentage of American population who still believe that Obama was born outside the United States, they still believe that. There's that birther thing that still is in the people's mind. And then there's the sad part to it. In Nigeria, this fake news about Christians Muslims killing Christians, and then the thing was share, like, kill. As a result of that, about 48 Christians were killed, Muslims were killed because of that. So this is to say that media is in one's control no longer. Now, how you would control this fake news, nobody at the moment has an answer to that, because you can't set up an international regulatory force to control it. So, and that is why governments are now looking to Facebook, Insta, Snapchat, and all of these things as to, hey, you are the guys who can control it.
But there's a reasonable amount of control on social media. For example, I keep seeing stuff on Twitter where people's accounts are shut down and things. And it's really because they've said something that someone who exercises some sort of censor power can then shut them down. And for example, a lot of people who spoke out on Kashmir, their accounts were shut down because apparently, the control was in India, and the Indian authorities managed to get Twitter to shut down a whole lot of accounts and things. So you do have that sort of censorship, even in social media.
No, it's all about the money, okay? I mean, Twitter makes a lot of money from India. And once the government of India raises its concerns to Twitter, you have immediate closure of whatever. Pakistan is not in the same, okay? You have so many things on Twitter or other media which go against Pakistan. And when the government talks about it, it's very difficult to convince, so it all depends on the type of economy and how you've dealt with. It's really the internal structures that you also set up.
Pakistan has its own Green Brigade. That every government of Pakistan official has a green pen, and they write everything in green ink. Yeah, it's true. I mean, I was quite... Everybody, everyone. It's the official ink of the government of Pakistan, green. So now, if anyone says fake news, that's a bit scary. So fake news is a big problem. I mean, Donald Trump made fake news. I think it's gotten into the dictionary as well or something. Fake news is like a big word or a phrase. And you touched on it a little bit. But when fake news comes from the highest authority, then how do you deal with that?
What do you mean highest authority?
Well, with Donald Trump, for example, the birther argument was his.
Well, I don't know what to say to that, quite frankly. I mean, he is the president of the United States and has his opinions. It started about 5 o'clock in the morning. And depending on how the news cycle is, his tweets go that way. There have been several books written about that, and I think it would be unfair for me to question that aspect of any president or prime minister's behavior. I think, it's a day and age that we live in. I mean, the nationalism vis-a-vis political freedoms and democracy is a completely different debate. And there's this wave of nationalism now sweeping our planet.
So in Pakistan had a really interesting experience. From we touched on this earlier. You talked about PTV, and you just had state-run media for the longest time, and then you had a second terrestrial channel come in, which was NTN, and then you had this huge mushrooming of television channels, and now we've got hundreds. So, how do you see? Well, forget them surviving, but how do you see these channels as being, the influencers, media, newscasters, news anchors? Everybody seems to be jockeying for position. There's a lot of shouting. There's a lot of drama. There's very little dispassionate news or information being passed on. It's all loud noise. So how does one deal with that?
Yeah. Well, look, let's look at
And
it.
also, how does Pakistan actually transcend this and become a more serious news business?
I hear of this from everyone, including my wife, that what is your channel talking about? Okay. So let's put it in a historical context. Firstly, if you look at most developing countries, we are at a very embryonic stage of television development. Initially, when you had, you've got about 100 TV channels at the moment, you had this move from print media into television, electronic media, without the requisite training that a TV producer, programmer, editor, news gatherer normally gets. And hence, you have this with the added pressure of getting ratings. But I do believe that they are looking at syllabuses. The universities are looking at how to change all of this. And it may take about 20 years or 30 years, but we will get into the seriousness of reporting news in the way it should be reported.
So we've talked a lot about ratings, but one of the big things is sensationalism, and you've touched on this in your book. You mentioned the Maya Khan episode. So without going into the details of it, how do you think television channels, producers, directors, owners should deal with these kinds of situations, which are really damaging, actually, for the public at large, not just the channel. Maybe they'll get the channel good ratings and eyeballs and stuff, but they're actually bad for society.
No, it's bad. It all depends on policy and policy guidelines. I mean, you start off being impartial and making sure everybody has a point of view and his point of view is heard. Your stories must always be double-checked before they go on air. As far as the Maya Khan incident was concerned, I can tell you what happened. I mean, I was not here. I was in Singapore, or I was traveling at that moment, and I heard about it, and I immediately rang up Naveed, our CEO, who's sitting there, and I told him that, look, ask her to apologize unconditionally, immediately, which she did not. She did not take it seriously. I mean, you cannot go out in a public park and start filming people and just to make sure that you get ratings. Now, her program in SAMAA was the highest rated program in Pakistan. Huge. And for me, when she did not apologize in the way that she should have, in my opinion, I had to ask the whole team to leave, and we closed that program down. So you've got to, and that sent a message that you cannot, thank you, that you cannot, do things like this and expect to get away with it, irrespective of the ratings that you have. So, you send a message, and that, I believe, was a good thing to do.
So following on from that, if you've taken that position, and that's a really bold position, and the audience here appreciated that, but other channels perhaps did not. And do you think there should be maybe some sort of an ethics code the channels sit down together, work on, decide that, we're going to follow this code, and anyone who deviates will then face some sort of sanction?
Well,
Because we need to enforce.
yeah.
There's a lot. I mean, there's so many incidents. This is just one, but there are hundreds, and every channel has had some incident.
Absolutely. Under the original draft, as drafted by Mr. Javed Jabbar, the original PEMRA ordinance, I was kind enough to consult me on that. I don't know for what reason, but anyway, there is a code of conduct there. So you've got the regulatory authority which has to be the primary enforcer of a code of conduct, code of ethics on television channels. I'm very clear on that. You cannot create multi-layers because that confuses the entire issue. However, it is who you have who regulates and what their knowledge is about media is where the question marks are. And that needs to be rectified. And as far as individual channels, really it won't be fair of me to comment on them because I think each individual owner or ownership have their own views on how their channels should operate. But I'm very clear in that you must be impartial, you must stick to a code of conduct. In fact, we have a 10-second delay on transmissions that are even going out live, just in case something is said which ought not to have been said, and we cut it off immediately.
I thought all channels were required to have that delay. But what one sees is that the thing goes out, you have instances of people slapping people on television, throwing things at people on television. You have all this stuff. It doesn't get cut off. They let it run because it's good copy. It's like, this is really entertaining. We've taken a boring chat show and we've turned it into, World Wrestling Federation or whatever it is. So you have that kind of problem. So what I was asking really was that, is there no organization of television network owners or any kind of regulatory body other than PEMRA where there is some kind of agreement amongst all the channels that, we will follow this code of conduct, and if anyone violates it, there will be some sanction because it's happening every day?
Well, the broadcasters, the owners have a forum. It's called the Pakistan Broadcasters Association, but which was basically set up to avoid any advertising defaults rather than discuss. I've never known a meeting that ever discussed the code of conduct as far as the Pakistan Broadcasting Association is concerned. It's really left up to each one of them, quite frankly. I'm not aware of any other organization or matter.
So given sensationalism, ratings, the fact that there are hundreds of channels, etc., what is the future of the television news business? Entertainment, I know, is huge. The music industry is huge. But what about the news business?
Well, that's interesting. The future, 6 months ago, the first robotic presenter appeared on air for a Chinese news channel. Okay? Now, that was news to me. No makeup expenses and 24 hours a day. Wow, what could be better? And I think AI will play a role. VR would play a role. And we are already seeing a little bit of all of this in the form of, you will see in about 20 years that you can actually, through VR, be put to where the news is happening, okay? And be part of it. And especially this applies in the sports industry, where it'll get better and better so that there is more interactive viewership between the channel and the viewer. Other than AI and what have you, I did a little bit of research for my book. I said, okay, anybody can predict, but it is the most difficult thing to predict and be right. Very few people get it right. However, I said, why do I not consult some crystal balls and some astrologers? So I contacted 3, one in Africa, one in Asia, and one in the UK. The Asia and Africa ones really proved to be not too good. And I asked them specific questions. Now, there was this one from Britain, and I found out who she was when she answered the questions It's in my book, actually, the questions I asked and the answers in detail, which she gave. But, you know, she comes from a 100-year-plus gypsy Romani family, and she's been doing palmistry since the age of 6. And her mother did it, grandmother did it, and her mother's mothers did it. And so she gave me she said, yes, I see robots playing a role, but since this is a creative business, there'll be some very creative person. But she also said that one day in the future, there will be a person who will control media, who will be half robot and half human. Okay? Then she said that we can actually, in the future, if somebody is baking a cake on television, you could be able to smell it. And if they are showing rain, you can actually feel part as though the rain is dropping. So there are various scenarios of what we can happen. But look, it took, 10,000 years from the first written word to the printing press, and then another 500 from the printing press to email, and then to the internet. Let's see, it's going very fast.